Okay, guys, I'm back. I had to take a little break. I was sitting on the bed doing the video, and my legs were folded underneath me. And at my age, I can't do that for as long as I could in the past. So I had to get up and change my seating situation and get a little comfortable, take a little break, give you guys a little break. But I want to continue talking about George Herbert Mead. I said in the last video that he came up with those 3 stages of development of the self: the preparatory stage, the play stage, and the game stage. And so if you look at table 4-1 in your textbook or in the PowerPoint, you'll see that it lists the 3 stages of the self according to Mead. In that preparatory stage, the self is not present, and the child pretty much imitates the actions of others without understanding the significance of those behaviors. And they give the example: when adults laugh and smile, the child will laugh and smile as well. Or they will, pretend to play on the work on the car, or they'll pretend to cook dinner if they see mom and I don't want to be too sexist in our expectations of men and women, but many mothers still are responsible for cooking supper. Fathers do it too. I know. I'm a dad who has cooked a lot of meals for my daughter, so I'm well aware that men are capable of doing those kinds of things. But traditionally, women have been given the role of being the caretaker of the home, the cook, the cleaning, and all of that kind of stuff. I know things are changing pretty dramatically, and I think it's great that they're changing, but that's been the reality in the past. And so in the preparatory stage, the kids don't really understand what the significance of their actions are, but they imitate. Okay. In the play stage, the self is still not really there, but it's beginning to develop the ability to communicate, the ability to understand symbols and use words, and listen to someone else talk and understand some of what they're saying is indication that the self is beginning to develop. The child takes the role of a single other as if he or she were the other. And so now the child may first take the role of patient and then the role of doctor, or the other way around. They're able then to take the role of other, or engage in role taking. That means that the self is beginning to develop. It's in development at that point. And then in the game stage, Mead said that yes, now the self is present, and the child will consider the roles of 2 or more others simultaneously. So now they understand that, hey, dad does this and the child does that, and they interact in these ways. If I'm playing a game, as the quarterback, I have to do certain things, but I also have to rely on my blockers to keep the other team from tackling me long enough for me to carry out the play. And if somebody misses their assignment, I know what I need to do to try to avoid having that breakdown and result in a loss, right? So, for example, in the game of hide and seek, the child will take into account the roles of both the hider and the seeker. Okay, so that's a fairly simple game, but we used a more complex game. We talked about baseball and football as examples of how kids can develop that understanding of multiple roles at one time when they reach that game stage. Okay, so Mead said that the self begins as a privileged central position in a person's world. Well, what does that mean? If you are familiar at all with Sigmund Freud and his idea of the id, he said that when a child is born, it's all selfish desires. And I think Mead is kind of echoing that sentiment. Mead says that young children think they're the focus of everything around them. So if you ask a child, what do you do for fun? Well, I like to play with trains. Well, what does your dad do for fun? Well, maybe he likes to play with trains too. They may kind of attribute other qualities about themselves to other people because they assume that, hey, I like these things, so everybody else ought to like them too. And so they're kind of the center of the universe at that point. You know, we're going to talk about the development of the id and the ego and the superego from the Freudian perspective. But Mead's ideas, I think, are very similar to Freud's ideas, where he's talking about when a child is born, it's hungry, it's wet and needs to be changed, it's needs comfort. It is the center of the universe, and we as parents are supposed to take care of the needs of that child by making it feel loved, by feeding it when it's hungry, by changing it when it's dirty, has a dirty diaper, and just loving and nurturing that child. So, I think Mead is dead on here that early on the child is the center of their universe, and we are there to meet their needs. And of course, significant others, as I said, are the ones who primarily bear that responsibility. Now, Goffman talked about what he called the presentation of the self. And Irving Goffman is another symbolic interactionist. And what he's saying is that a lot of our daily activities involve attempts to convey impressions to others of who we are. So think about a first date. Think about a job interview. These are situations where we want to control the information that someone else has about us, and we want them to see us in a particular way, and we engage in behaviors that try to convey that, okay? So if you're going to a job interview and you're wearing flip-flops and shorts and a t-shirt, that better be a job working on the beach as a lifeguard or something, or you're probably not going to get that job, right? You're not going to get an office job as a professional if you show up like you just got out of Spicoli's van in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I know that's an old movie. That's probably a very dated reference. But check it out. You know, you might want to know who Spicoli is because he's an interesting character in that movie. Okay? So Goffman says that we engage in what he called impression management. I want to manage how you feel about me by controlling the information that you have about me. So on a first date, your goal is to find out who that other person is and determine if you are interested in getting to know them better on a second date, right? At the same time that they're trying to get to know who you are and determine if they want a second date or not. And so it's interesting that while we're trying to get information from the other person, we're trying to control the information that they get about us. And that can be a very stressful thing, right? That's why dating can be stressful, because on the one hand, you're trying to find out about this other person and determine if you have things in common that you would like to explore further. At the same time that you're trying to get them to see you in a particular way, and you're being somewhat guarded about the behavior that you share with them. And so that's what we mean by impression management. Whether you're going to a job interview and you're trying to present yourself as a professional with your tie or your business suit, ladies, and your professional behavior, and yes, sir, and you're presenting a certain type of behavior. You're engaging in certain behaviors to influence how that person perceives you as a potential good employee. And that may not be how you behave in your everyday life, and it isn't. We don't behave the same way at a job interview that we do in our everyday life, or if we do, we probably don't have successful job interviews because people expect us in an interview to behave a little bit differently than we behave when we're hanging out with our friends or hanging out with our cousins or our other family members or, going to school or whatever. Okay. Goffman also developed what he called the dramaturgical approach, where he broke things down into backstage and front stage, and he talked about, the whole world is a play. He stole from Shakespeare in this respect. He said that, we all have different roles that we have to play, and we have to learn the expectations that go with each of those roles. So as a student, you have certain things that you're supposed to do. You need to read your textbook. You need to purchase and read the textbook. You need to do well on exams. You need to turn in assignments on time to be a successful student. Okay. To be a successful friend, you need to be honest with your friend, well, mostly honest, right? Sometimes you might not want to tell them that dress, yes, that dress does make them look fat. You don't want to say that, so you might say something like, well, you've got dresses that are much more flattering to your figure than that one, okay? And you're trying to be honest at the same time that you're also trying to take into consideration your friend's feelings, and you don't want to be 100% honest, but you still want to convey to them that, yeah, you don't want to wear that dress. Okay, so there are certain expectations that we have of our friends. So, for example, let's say that a friend ask you not to tell a secret, and then they tell you that they are planning to commit suicide. Well, to be a good friend, you have to look out for their best interest, right? And in this case, even though you promised you wouldn't tell them tell their secret to anyone, you feel compelled to contact mental health care professionals or parents or someone to try to make sure that this friend doesn't harm themselves. And you know that you may lose the friendship. They may be so angry at you for sharing their secret that they don't ever talk to you again. Most of us would say, well, I might have lost a friend, but at least they're still alive. And so, you have those competing criteria of friendship, keeping the secret, but protecting your friend. You've got those two competing obligations, and you have to make a decision which route you're going to go. Okay, so this dramaturgical approach is the idea that we're all playing various roles, and when you're hanging out with your parents and other family members, you behave in certain ways, but when you go to a job interview, you behave in a different way. When you go out on a date, you behave in another way. And so and there's front stage and backstage. When you guys go to a class, the professor gets up there and presents all of this information and lectures and talks about different things, and that's what you see front stage. What you didn't see backstage was the hours and hours of work that professor put into developing that lecture and practicing and using different demonstrations and trying to test them out and see which one would be most effective. You didn't see all the grades, the grading of the papers and all that kind of stuff that also takes place. So think about front stage and backstage. You're on a date with somebody, and the waiter is coming out, and they're taking your order, and they're being very calm, and everything's very pleasant, and it's wonderful. But backstage, back there in the kitchen, the chef just got mad and quit, and now everybody's trying to cover for the chef and cook the dishes, and you're totally unaware of what's going on backstage. But because front stage, everything is calm and everything's wonderful, and your order will be out in a few minutes. And is there something I can get you while you're waiting for your food to come out? Would you like an appetizer or something? There's that whole nice, calm environment, but backstage things are going crazy. Okay, so that dramaturgical approach focuses on the fact that we all play many roles. There's a division between what's happening out there in the open that we all see and what's happening back there in the background, front stage and backstage, and that's what we mean by the dramaturgical approach. Goffman also talked about the necessity of what he called face work, and that is a need to maintain a proper image of self in order to continue social interaction. So most of us engage in face work at some time or another. Have you ever been having a conversation with somebody, a new friend that you weren't really close to yet, but you felt like you might want to remain friends with this person and develop a better friendship, and you said something that came out wrong? You're like, oh gosh, I wish. Well, a lot of times when we make mistakes like that in our interactions with other people, we or they will engage in what we call face work or face saving behavior. They will play it off as a joke. Oh, you're so funny. I can't believe you said that. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm glad you thought I was joking, because I said something I didn't really mean to say. It came out wrong. I knew it as soon as it came out. I knew it sounded crazy, but we both laughed about it and went on. That person engaged in some face work. Those two people engaged in some face work by playing that off as a joke, and allowed them to maintain their sense of self so that they could continue the interaction rather than being so embarrassed that they just had to run away and hide. Okay, so that's what Goffman meant by face work, and most of us do at some time or another engage in some face work. We do say things and do things that come out and are misinterpreted by other people, and hopefully they will let us play that out as a joke and move on and not have it harm our sense of self to the extent that we can't continue those interactions. Okay. All right, so let's look at some of the psychological approaches. I've already talked a little bit about Sigmund Freud and his approach to the development of the self. He said that the self is a social product. Well, what does that mean? Well, that kind of means that it develops through interactions with other people, right? Does that sound somewhat like what George Herbert Mead said and Goffman and Cooley? Absolutely. Okay, so I don't see a big difference here, but certainly the focus is a little bit different. Freud stressed that the roles of our inborn drives, such as our need for sexual gratification or survival, that flight or fight risk, where we feel threatened and we either run away or we decide to become aggressive. Those kinds of reactions and inborn drives influence us a lot. And so we're trying to, a lot of life is learning how to deal with the needs, the immediate gratification that we seek, and looking for deferred gratification. So our natural impulsive instincts are in conflict with societal constraints. And Freud once made the statement in one of his books that every man was a rapist in his heart to the extent that he had not developed a superego. That's a lot to unpack. Let's think about that. So what Freud was saying is that if a man sees a woman, we're assuming here a heterosexual man, if a man sees a woman that he finds attractive, that he will want to have sex with that woman. But he can't just go up and have sex with her. That would be sexual assault, right? So he can't just have sex with every woman that he finds desirable. So he has to find an appropriate way to express those needs and desires. Okay, so the natural impulse is there's somebody that's attractive. I want to have sex with them. I'm going to have sex with them. But society says, wait a minute, you can't do that. This woman has the right to say no. She has the right to consent or to refuse to consent. And so you can't just have sex with somebody just because you find them attractive. That would be inappropriate. So society says, no, you can't do that, at least not in that way. And so much of life is learning to defer your needs and or much of socialization in developing this sense of self is learning to deal with those drives and needs that we all have as human beings in a way that is socially acceptable. Okay, so the young man sees the young woman that he finds desirable. He asks her out on a date. He takes her out and they have a good time. They get to know each other. They have a meal together. They go to a movie. There's a goodnight kiss at the end of the evening. He asks for a second date. He continues to see her, and they have a good time. And eventually, they develop a relationship in which it is acceptable to express those needs for sexual gratification. That's kind of a more acceptable way of doing that. So, Freud also said that our personalities are influenced by others, particularly our parents. So the parental relationships, again, I told you that those would be really important no matter whose theory we're talking about. And so parental relationships are still very important in terms of how a child learns to accept that, hey, just because I want something, I can't have it right now. Maybe I have to work hard. Maybe I have to date someone for a period of time and develop a relationship in which it's okay to express those sexual feelings. Or perhaps I have to work hard at a job in order to move up in the socioeconomic ladder of our organization and things of that nature. I can't just go in and be the boss on day one. Doesn't work that way, right, for most of us. So our personalities are influenced by others. When we're born, we're all selfish desires. We're all id, but eventually we start to internalize society's expectations, and that's when we develop that super ego that Freud was talking about. And then the ego is the part of the brain, the mind that kind of mediates between our selfish desires and society's expectations and helps us to figure out, well, okay, you can't do this in this way, so what's a way that you can get your needs met? And so the ego is kind of the mediator between the id and the superego. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Piaget. Piaget is another psychologist who developed some theories about different stages that people go through when they're developing as human beings. And he said that newborns have no self in the sense of a looking glass image, just as other researchers said. The self is not present early on, right? And Piaget said that infants are quite self-centered. Sounds familiar, right? And he said that as children mature, they are gradually socialized. Okay. And so he identified cognitive stages of development. And so he said that there were four primary stages of development in children's thought processes. The first one is the one he called sensory motor. At this point, we're talking about newborn children up to a couple of years of age, just as we did in some of the other theories. We're talking about very young children who are trying to understand their social world through putting everything in their mouth, tasting and smelling and feeling things, right? That's where the sensory motor. They're beginning to move around. They're beginning to crawl in the floor, and they're exploring their world, and they're tasting and smelling and feeling everything that they can get their hands on. That's why you have to be very careful as a parent to pick up choking hazards and things of that nature, because children are trying to experience their world through their senses at that point. Then they reach the pre-operational stage, and this is probably going to be around 2 years of age or so. I'm not sure that Piaget necessarily quantified it that way, but I think it's safe to say that somewhere around 2 years of age, children begin to speak and use words and to use symbols to distinguish ideas and objects. And so they're starting to be able to communicate with others, and that's the pre-operational stage.